Do, 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 do. Hello. Greetings. How you doing? Something to be true, it has to be logical and wise, and certainly so mirrored in every way in nature. Us crazy human critters, of course, have all sorts of words, and words are just concepts. Words are not things themselves. People get hung up on words, and people will, of course, debate words endlessly, but as that movie line goes, the means to meaning. Talk about counterspace, and I have to admit, counterspace is kind of a ridiculous word. There are a few people that have used counterspace. We could say zero-point energy, we could say the ether, we could say a sink, we could say the plane of inertia. We could talk about the null point, the intersecting modality, and substrate, the foundation under all phenomena. Something that I myself and every aspect of so-called scientists agree upon is that, for example, the entire Earth itself and all atoms are an accurate statement, 99.999% empty space. That's partially accurate, but mostly inaccurate. In other words, every atom is nothing other than a super gigantic balloon with a nucleus in the middle, and if we were able to reduce out the interatomic volume of every atom, just to its nucleus, then the Earth would be something a little bit smaller than a marble. And that is accurate, and the profundity of that should not be lost on anybody. But what about counterspace? What are we referring to in counterspace? We have to understand, of course, what space is and what are we meaning by the word counterspace, which is kind of a ridiculous word. I mean, say counterspace, I think we're like talking about the counterspace in your kitchen where you chop your vegetables up on. But I mean, it doesn't make any difference if we say ether, say pure potential, the plane of inertia, or a sink. A black hole, for example, is nothing other than a super dielectric sink. Human beings are fundamentally confused about a black hole because we actually have no analogy here on Earth by which to compare it to. It's not a hole. We call a black hole a hole, and it's not actually black. And black holes are actually emitting, as is evidenced by countless telescopes and countless images, whether you agree with it or not, emitting out trillions and trillions of tons of the most fundamental particle, of which all atoms are the basic building block thereof, emitting out hydrogen. You can look up galactic jets. They're also too called astrophysical jets. That's not fundamentally important. And of course, fundamental matter, i.e. hydrogen, is nothing other than super high energy light, and that was recently proven. That was a prediction I made years ago. I've always spent years trying to reconcile light and matter, and I'm ashamed of myself that I didn't reconcile it initially a long time ago, because Mother Nature is so incredibly simple. So she's like a hippie chick with dreadlocks and hairy armpits and a hemp skirt. Nature is not in any way complex at all. The only thing nature deals in is pressure mediation, force and motion, inertia and acceleration. Everything's either capacitance, resistance, permeability, and permittivity, but I like to actually get on to explaining counterspace in as simple a terms as possible. Once again, black hole is nothing other than a dielectric sink. It's where actual dielectricity overthrown magnetism's ability to keep anything in the visible universe. When I actually talked about the Earth, if we were able to reduce every atom to its nucleus only, then the Earth would be something smaller than the size of a marble. People need to fundamentally realize that magnetism is that which gives mass and magnitude to everything in the universe. When we actually have a mass that's so large and it becomes a point source object, essentially a super gigantic magnet out in space, it vanishes from the visible universe. This video is not about black holes, but I want to make that simple analogy that things only have mass and magnitude due to magnetism only, and the three-dimensional force vector of magnetism is the torus. If you actually take a piece of wire and you bend it like an S, and you take either end of that S and you bend it inverse to one another, you're actually extrapolating out the three-dimensional. I could actually draw on this if I had a Sharpie marker. Not that I really want to draw on this apple because I'll eat it later. I could actually take a knife here and actually could draw a three-dimensional S-curve right into the center of the apple and come out here and come out inverse here. So we actually have this three-dimensional force vector that is magnetism, the loss of energy or inertia of counterspace of the dielectric, Okay, manifests as a three-dimensional force vector that is the torus, the extrapolation of which is this, the torus, or this apple, for example. What do we mean by counter space? Rather a nonsense term. We're talking about the plane of inertia, or the point where all potential exists. The loss of that energy or potential is the only thing human beings rationalize as existing. We reify space as something that exists and it doesn't exist. Space is the after effect of a divergent magnetic field. It is literally the inverse or negative image of pure potential. Yeah. What is the opposite of pure potency? It would be pure impotency. Yeah. And Nikola Tesla accurately said space has no properties, space is impotency. The greatest masters throughout all of history have said that space is impotency. And it's so great because our entire lives we've listened to science fiction. Space is infinite. It goes on and on forever. But it's nothing. It has no properties. It's the super gigantic toothless dragon that is forever sleeping. It is nothing itself. It is the negative image of pure potential, which is pure impotency. Yes, it's the volume of the torus. And of course, we live in the torus of existence, exeostan, so it only means to be outside of yourself. And I cut this apple in half here in a second. But smaller the space, the higher the capacity. I've actually had quite a few people, I didn't cut this perfectly right in half, there we go. A lot of people actually attack me using the word counter space, and I'm not the first one to actually use the word counter space, but who cares what term we assign it? We want to call it the ether, zero-point energy, the plane of inertia. It doesn't, my God, this smells really good. It doesn't matter what we call it. We're talking about the inverse of space. Pure, unmanifest, non-Cartesian, anti-Cartesian potential. Yeah? The original denotation of the term inertia, not our current connotation of the term inertia. Here's the fact. Like on the power lines that actually go out in front or back of your house, if you actually increase the voltage, because this is a fact, by the way, the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. In the case of human comprehension, something that's larger can hold more stuff, like a larger box can hold more stuff. But in terms of energy, the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. Here's an absolute fact. And this happens in the case of lightning strikes, and it happens in energy anomalies along power transmission lines in alternating current. And by the way, the diagram, and I don't have it pulled up here, of Charles Proteus Steinmetz, that cross-sectional diagram, which is basically, looks like a toroid, and the negative image of a toroid is a hyperboloid, just like the half of this apple here. You can actually see this half of an apple is a toroid shape. Right here where all pure potential exists, which of course this little thing that, you know, a dumb monkey, for example, would say looks like a piece of poo from a rat, is the pure potential for the tree, the ultimate potential of this apple. Human beings, all of us, analogously as far as it pertains to the metaphysics and physics of this universe, are only interested in the apple. It feeds us, you know, we can can it, we can make pies out of it. This is the only thing we care about. But analogously, and counter space has to be mirrored in everything in nature, and it is. This is pure potential. This seed within which, of course, is potential for another tree and countless thousands of apples in perpetuity. This, of course, this actually has volume, so we can't take that analogy too far, but everything that we actually experience in life is experienced through orifices and holes. We actually give birth through orifices. We experience everything in our life through orifices of our ears and our eyes and our nose and our mouth. And all of this is mirrored in nature. And yet that that people would mock this term counter space, and it is kind of a ludicrous term, but that's only if you get wrapped up in words. If you're so superficial that you get wrapped up in words, then of course you're never going to understand anything. Doesn't matter what people call it. But anyway, getting back to the power lines, in the case of a power anomaly on the power lines, if the voltage spikes, the power lines, which dangle kind of loosely between the power poles, if the voltage spikes, which is the dielectric, yeah, if the voltage spikes, the power lines, as they're drooping there between the poles, will actually come together. The actual toroid itself will shrink, yeah, because the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. Higher voltage makes those power lines actually sway towards one another, towards counter space, because the capacitance is greatly increased, and the nature of pressure mediation vis-a-vis the field, and of course the electric field between those power lines, is the construct of the dielectric and the magnetic, both of which of course comprise electricity. If, however, the amperage increase, the actual power lines will actually push themselves apart. If the magnetism, along the power lines increases, they'll actually push themselves apart because the actual toroidal geometry of the magnetic field has been increased along the power lines. So if the voltage spikes, they'll actually swing towards one another. If the magnetism spikes along the power lines, they'll actually be pushed apart. This is a fact, by the way. You can look this up. Don't take my word for it, but this is the conjugate geometry of the universe, the hyperboloid and the torus. The hyperboloid is the hourglass shape. It is the geometry of increasing inertia and acceleration towards counter space. Yes, the negative image, and this, of course, is just a half of an apple. The negative image of this toroidal cross-section of the apple is a hyperboloid, or a dual hourglass shape, or an hourglass shape itself. I should say dual hourglass. There's actually dual bulb, and of course terminating right here in the center of this apple, where nothing is at all. Right here, yeah, right here where nothing is. Now, either side, in closest proximity, yes, are the seeds, the genesis, or the null point. People always have energy backwards. People think of energy as like a nuclear blast, for example. It's a gigantic mushroom cloud. By the way, a mushroom cloud, as it rises, the only reason why it rises is due to heat. That mushroom cloud is what shape? Mushroom cloud is toroidal shape. People consider that to be energy. That's the impotency of energy. You think about it, and I'm just using this analogously in the case of a nuclear explosion. The actual increasing mushroom cloud, where space and volume and all sorts of horrible things are generated, including a gigantic toroidal mushroom cloud is generated, which rises due to heat. It is not energy, it's the impotency of energy. True energy would be that softball-sized lump of plutonium, fissionable plutonium, or fissionable uranium. The seed, if you will. It's hard to hold a seed because it's kind of slick and wet. Oops, sorry, I can't hold the seed, so... Anyway, this is the conjugate geometry of the universe. The negative image of a hyperboloid, or the hourglass shape, is the torus. The negative image of the torus is the hyperboloid. The superposition of both is, of course, a sphere. The negative image of a torus is a hyperboloid. The negative image of a hyperboloid is a torus. This is the conjugate geometry that actually explains everything in the universe. Everything is either force and motion, inertia and acceleration. The loss of that energy or inertia from counter space, yes. And why is there anything at all? And then, of course, we have to get into explaining the extrinsic attribute of the absolute of the agathon, which is phi to the power of -3, as against that plane of inertia or counter space, i.e. the ether itself. Well, we use the word counter space. You would say sink. The sink of counter space, the plane of inertia, the nexus point from which everything is manifest. Anyway, also, too, of course, I can't put this apple back together, but I'm going to slice it right along the top here. You ever think about the top or bottom of an apple? I'm going to have to slice, the top of this apple and the bottom of this one, since I've already cut the apple up. We're actually looking at a vortex or a sink. Oops, I need to put that piece right back together there. We're looking at a vortex or a sink, right? Top or bottom of any torus, we actually have a sink, yeah, a conjugate sink. I say, well, a magnet has a north pole and a south pole. It actually doesn't. It has the inverse of counter space. The inverse of counter space is the three-dimensional force vector of magnetism itself, which creates space. Space is not a thing in itself. Space is the impotency of pure potential, the after effect of a divergent magnetic field. What is counter space? I mean, aren't we supposed to be answering a question in our minds such that we have a more clear and precise understanding of the nature of Natura Naturans, or Mother Nature? What is counter space? Pure potential, the plane of inertia, the non-Cartesian or anti-Cartesian nexus from which all things spring. This is mirrored everywhere in nature. It's mirrored in your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, and various other orifices from which all things pass and pass into. Everything in nature mirrors this. Black hole, like I said, is nothing other than a super gigantic dielectric sink where magnetism has been overthrown. We have no parallel on this earth of something that's so massive and has attained to a point source that it vanishes from the visible universe. Things exist in the visible universe only due to one thing, and all of science agrees on this. They don't fundamentally understand it at all. They'll tell you every atom is 99.9999% empty space. Well, not. Every atom is nothing other than an atomic dynamo. It's a magnetodielectric dynamo. The volume of every atom measured in picometers, is due to magnetism and magnetism only. That's the volume of every atom. That's the volume of all matter, is due to magnetism. The toroidal geometry of force and motion. Counterspace, or the ether, or subspace, zero-point energy, who cares what people call it? It doesn't make any difference. These are merely conceptual words in English language only to refer to something that people don't have any concept thereof, because none of us grew up thinking about this stuff, at least none of you did anyway, thinking about this stuff or being taught about this stuff in high school or college or elementary school or otherwise. So what is counterspace? Counterspace is the substrate or foundation for which everything else is built upon, arises from, and returns to. Everything. You can't have magnetism without the dielectric. Magnetism is not a source field. It is not. It is the after effect of it, because magnetism is, quote unquote, as Faraday said, the dielectric field. Yes? That's like saying ice is the dielectric field of water. Yeah? Ice actually expands as it freezes. Of course, water has volume too, so we can't take that analogy too far, but to say that ice is one thing and water is another is, of course, fundamentally ignorant. Anybody with a half a brain, or even less than that, knows that ice and water are one and the same thing. Ice is hard, it has a little more volume, it expands. That's all magnetism is. Magnetism is the ice of water in relationship to the dielectric. Dielectricity is, of course, the ether under stress or strain. The ether itself is the substrate or foundation of everything. That is counterspace. There's no distinction between the ether and counterspace. When we say counterspace, we're making this reference to space. And the reason why we make reference to space is because existential empirical beings of flesh and blood and our Wi-Fi enabled meat sack, humorously as I quoted myself a couple days ago, live within that spherical universe of mass and magnitude. That's all we know. But it's a shame that that's all we know, because to admit to one, we must understand the other. People talk endlessly about space as if it is something that does things and acts upon other things. I mean, that's the fundamental fallacy of relativity, and of quantum it's reified this concept that has no properties, that does not act upon other things. Yeah. Two masses in space are not bending space and time. They actually have a dielectric torsion. They're actually accelerating not towards one another, but towards a null point in counterspace. This is fundamentally viewable underneath the ferrocell. Magnets are not accelerating towards one another, which is not magnetic attraction, by the way, it's dielectric acceleration. They're accelerating towards a null point in counterspace, the lowest pressure point between those two masses, because that's all Mother Nature does, is deal in pressure mediation. So, I'll fundamentally agree that counterspace is a crazy word. But you fundamentally, if you have a brain at all, have to understand that there is no apple without the seed of counterspace. It's completely impossible. And then we get into the whole thing of which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? But let's not go there. You know, for anybody to deny or scoff at counterspace is to ludicrously say that you have apples or apple trees without this. Pure, unmanifest potential, because the seed is not sprouted. Let's not take the analogy too far. I mean, how stupid would someone be to scoff at counterspace? Might as well scoff at apples and apple trees without the seeds of pure potential, within which all potential exists. Of course, what is potential is not actual. In the case of Mother Nature, what is potential is necessitated, and this is why the Greeks called this termanake. They also too called it tolma. It is necessitated. It's also a reason why I have that discovery tattooed on the inside of my right wrist there, 1/5 to the power of -3. The expression of counterspace, or the one, i.e. the agathon, as against itself, its extrinsic attribute of manifestation. Yeah? So, I hope I made that clear. I'll eat this apple later, I won't waste it. But it is impossible for anybody to deny counterspace, regardless of what term they wish to assign to it. It's completely impossible, it's illogical, absurd, and laughable. You cannot have volume without that which makes volume possible. Because space is not a thing at all. Space has no properties. That's a direct quote from Nikola Tesla, by the way. So, before everything, there is counterspace, or the ether, or the plane of inertia. All one and the same thing. Euphemisms for one and the same thing. There's a really bad lightning storm coming outside. I could hear the thunder off in the distance. And I saw a lightning flash a second ago. Anyway, thank you so much for watching.